You look in your bank account. It's the same number as last week, give or take a few digits. But somehow, it buys less. Your groceries inexplicably cost more. So does your rent. And in some distant capital, a man you've never heard of has just changed the rules about how much your life actually costs. His name is Kevin Warsh. He is now the most powerful economic actor in the land, and during his first month in office, he engaged in an act not seen in modern times. He unmade the rulebook. The Federal Reserve used to operate in a certain way, one that relied on long-winded statements and careful guidance through carefully crafted language. They would release a dot plot, an economic forecast, which investors would parse for any sign about future interest rates. But not anymore. Warsh has thrown away the dot plot, replaced the long-winded statements with something much shorter, and held a much shorter press conference to explain it all. He has just told the markets that the Federal Reserve has been talking too much about things that don't actually matter. Why would he do such a thing? Why should you care? What does all of this have to do with your life? The strange thing about markets is that they are not driven by what happens, but rather by what happens in our heads. An economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes once said that markets are inherently irrational. People see a certain sequence of events, expect a future to unfold, and start behaving in ways that make that future a reality. When consumers expect prices to rise, they start buying more now, which causes prices to actually rise. When investors expect a recession, they start selling off shares, causing a recession to occur. This idea is so deeply ingrained in our understanding of markets that central banks actually spend years trying to manage and control people's expectations of the economy. They failed spectacularly in the 1930s, when the Fed proceeded to tighten the money supply at the worst possible time, worsening the Depression. Milton Friedman later argued that one of the contributing factors to the downturn was people's inaccurate perceptions of economic reality, which were exacerbated by the lack of transparency from the banking system. Central banks subsequently became much more open about their inner workings, believing that openness was the best way to guide people's perceptions of the economy. This approach was later embraced by the Fed as well, with Ben Bernanke arguing that communication was the most important tool that a central bank had to stabilize markets. For almost 2 decades, this mantra held true. Central banks provided long, detailed statements with forecasts about the future of money, rates, prices, and inflation. Almost every week, statements would be made by Fed officials, studied by traders and investors, who would then adjust their behavior accordingly. Kevin Warsh does not believe in this narrative. His arguments are not dissimilar to those of the 1930s, when critics accused bank leaders of manipulating markets by adjusting the money supply and providing misleading information to the public. By constantly communicating with markets, not only about the economy, but about the expectations of the Federal Reserve itself, central banks stop being able to control the economy. Investors no longer look at the state of the economy, but rather at what the Fed is going to say about the economy and react accordingly. In Warsh's opinion, these signals drown out actual information about the economy, providing investors with false cues about what to do with their stocks, bonds, and mortgages. By removing this noise, he would allow investors to actually look at the real-world data about employment, spending, money, and prices. It is hard to disagree with such logic, but there is a subtle detail which people who adhere to it often miss. The less guidance that the Federal Reserve provides to markets, the more risk it creates. To put it most simply, rates on mortgages and loans do not exist in a vacuum. Their value depends on the expectations about the future of the Fed funds rate, the theoretical rate of return that the Fed tries to establish. These expectations, in turn, depend on what the Fed says. By removing some of this guidance, the Federal Reserve creates an environment of uncertainty in which investors feel the need to protect themselves by demanding higher rates of return. This is especially true for investors who rely on the Fed as their major source of information about the economy. In an environment of uncertainty, they would demand higher returns to make up for the additional risk, which would cause rates to rise across the board. This has immediate tangible consequences for your wallet. At the very first meeting of his reign, Warsh's Fed kept rates steady, but suggested that they could rise later in the year. This is not unusual since such language is designed to keep markets on edge and ready for any possibility. But the shift came faster and harder than most people were expecting, causing stocks to drop across the board and treasury yields to rise. The same happened to the value of the dollar, which climbed steadily against other currencies, and gold, which traditionally benefits from falling bond yields, saw its prices drop. None of these shifts are directly felt by the economy as a whole, but they have real unpleasant consequences for anyone who actually holds bonds, stocks, or gold. The value of their investments has dropped, threatening their retirement savings and pushing them to reassess their options. This is the real reason why the markets are so sensitive to what the Fed says and does. They are constantly shifting in response to the information that they get, which in turn shapes our expectations of the broader economy. When the economy is booming, we feel richer and take on more debt, increasing our consumption. When the economy slows down and the value of bonds rises, our assets shrink, making us poorer and less willing to spend. The entire system is a giant feedback loop that is governed, guided, and in many ways determined by a few people in one small building in Washington. You have no direct say in who gets to lead the Federal Reserve, but you do have a direct say in how their decisions affect you and what you can do about it. Any shift in the value of assets is immediately passed on to consumers, shaping their ability to spend and their willingness to take on debt. When the Federal Reserve speaks less and reacts more, markets react more dramatically, affecting everything from mortgage rates to bond yields to stock prices. If you have any exposure to these assets, you are affected as well. If you have a retirement fund that relies on stocks, bonds, or any other asset, it is now much more volatile than it was a year ago. What should you do about it? You can no longer rely on the Federal Reserve to telegraph its intentions with each carefully chosen word. For years, investors would eagerly await the Fed's statements, carefully analyzing their language for clues about future rates. This has stopped being the case, and it will not return, at least not in the near future. Instead, investors now have to rely on their understanding of economics to determine future rates, which means that economic literacy is now more important than ever. Rather than simply memorizing them, facts and figures about inflation, unemployment, prices, and money now have real-world applications, as a solid grasp of them allows you to understand how the economy works and what you can do to prepare for future changes. At the same time, a diversified portfolio is now much more valuable than it used to be. With the uncertainty introduced by the Fed's new policies, having all your money in one asset, one stock, or one security is now much riskier than it was a year ago. The same applies to trusting one source about the economy, which is why learning to rely on actual data about the job market, prices, money, and the state of the economy is so important right now. In many ways, that is exactly what Warsh has tried to accomplish. By reducing the amount of information coming from the Federal Reserve, he has forced everyone to look elsewhere, relying on actual facts rather than on Wall Street analysts for their information about the economy. Kevin Warsh will either go down as one of the most radical reformers in the history of the American economy, or as one of the biggest ideologues who failed to understand the true mechanics of markets. What we do know is that his tenure has changed the way markets work forever. We also know the rulebook is not written for economists, but for people like you and me, those of us who check our bank accounts week after week, searching for signs of change, knowing or at least suspecting that they are not there. You will look in your bank account again this week and find the same amount as last. Somewhere in Washington, a much smaller group of people have just changed the rules, rewriting them in much shorter sentences than before.